The meeting of our policy committee of the West Bend Joint School District Number 1. It is 4:15 on Wednesday, July 21st, and we've got all three of our policy committee members here. Paul Fisher, Chris Swigert, I'm Joel Unger. We've got Superintendent Jen Wimmer. I will officially call this meeting to order. Superintendent, can you confirm this meeting was properly posted?
Yes, it was.
All right, on our agenda tonight, we've got a further review of 100 series policies, and then we'll start diving into 200 series policies. I will make a motion to approve our agenda.
Second.
Any discussion or thoughts on the agenda? If not, in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None? Great, Superintendent, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. This is an extension of our last conversation. We took kind of a first pass at these series, so we're going back in for a deeper dive. Recall that if you click in the 100 series or the 200 series, the agenda item, we've got a really nice dashboard. So not only you can follow along, but our community can follow along. The tab that we're visiting is the 7/21/21 committee meeting. It's right after the master listing of all our policies. I take notes during that last meeting around what was the discussion, the dialogue, and what did we want to see come forward. As you know, we're slated to start bringing rounds of policies per our schedule that we adopted to our next board meeting. So without further ado, I'm just going to go right through what we had discussed. The first one was 113. This is a mandated policy. It's a lot of legal pieces and really gets at non-discrimination in district programs, activities, and operations. This is the recommended language. Before we brought this forward, we consulted with other districts, WASB, around updates, opportunities to maybe tighten it up. But again, it's really laying out the process by which we would look at any potential complaints, who's in charge of those pieces in the organization, who we would expect to be fully trained to execute any of those pieces.
Great.
Any questions? Last time we had no questions. We were ready to kind of bring this one forward. The next one was around kind of taking some key concepts around 130, which is like a general organization policy. So we took some key concepts and I've revised it to a 130 policy. And we have some headings there. So we're not lost in a lot of language, but it's just an overview. We talked about who our school district is, who we serve, what are the general responsibilities of a board member, that those are elected, and what that term looks like. So we were just taking some of the concepts and putting them together in a manner easy for board members to understand as well as our public.
Yep.
Any questions as we look at this? Or I think, again, we were trying to be in attention to a visual layout that was easy to access for our community. So 130, I bring that forward?
One question on this one. In the last meeting, we talked about the at-large aspect, and I don't see that specifically in here, but it also doesn't talk about being elected on a aldermanic district type basis. So does the lack of that, of any?
Yeah, we don't have it so stated, but I mean, it's not going to hurt us. Do you want 7 members
Consist of
serve
7 at-large
at-large
members
Yeah.
at the tail end of line 11?
7 at-large members, we'll just put that.
That works for me.
Perfect.
Yep.
Perfect, and I'll make that change, and that's what you'll see going forward.
It's almost redundant there. When you list all the towns and villages, is comprised of 7 school board members, period. Under the statutes of Wisconsin and by action of the electors of joint number 1, the school board consists of 7 members.
Yeah, that's probably just a typo.
Yeah. But
I'm just gonna put a period after West Bend, because that's who we are. And then under that statute,
There you
we're
go.
electing and having that, so I'll make that change. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Again, I think it takes all those concepts in all those one-off policies and puts them together in a meaningful way. The next was 133. You'll recall we were keeping 133 in its entirety. Take a look at that second page. And again, following along in a markup format, any new language is highlighted in yellow. we were looking at policy 134 around military service and putting something in there, honoring that people called for active duty now might be able to participate in different ways, virtually, and then looking at the length of that absence and bringing it back to the board to understand, do we need to fill that? Is it a vacancy? What do we need to do there? And again, honoring that participation can look different now. So those were the only new, so that we could then remove 134, which was just about military service absences.
Mhm.
Any questions, comments, or considerations for that? I think we wanted to honor, I think in the past policy, it honored that they were serving, but it almost kicked them out.
Yeah.
And that was not the intention, so.
Right.
Update with the times that we can participate in different ways. The next one, around board officers, so it was looking at 141, and what we added in yellow, that very first part, was more of a preamble. Again, none of these are required policies, so if we're too wordy, now's the time to take that pen and cross out more. But we wanted to add just a bit of a preamble to our roles and those descriptions.
Just for further clarification on line 11, could we make that read, voting for board officers shall be done position by position? Using the following, one of the following, sorry, I thought I was reading one by one, must be my glasses.
Well, they vote in the following order to completion. So you would do president, be done, vice president, be done, treasurer, be done, that kind of thing.
Okay,
So is there something we need to clean up on language?
I was up late last night.
Everyone was.
Do we place the Oxford comma in line 13 after treasurer?
Our favorite, of course.
Thank you.
That was good.
Yeah,
Right,
does look good.
and
Thanks.
like we said, we had this spring, as part of the reorganization that occurs every spring, we had taken these to all of our board members who were serving in those roles to reflect on that, to make sure that language was continued to be sound. The next one really is just 151. Take a look at, we're cleaning up just the title. So you see some strike through. It's in aligning it to the actual numbers, WASB, it's the school board governance section and what the actual title would be. And then you'll see on 22, we're getting rid of Microsoft Word reference, and then line 57, the Adobe reference, and just talking about will be made available on the district website, just a nuance of language.
That was good.
And again, same process with the different readings, and that's how we built our calendar as well as we look at things. While not necessary, I just wanted to show in the next one the AR that we took out this is how you have to and when you have to do each policy series, so that actually comes to the policy committee and we create that calendar. So we've got that. Same thing with removing, sorry, this one's not mocked up by line item, under availability and archival, the reference to PDF specifics, Microsoft Word. And then on the next page, it also says Microsoft Word, so getting rid of that and how to save that. Again, that's old school Microsoft Word. We just need to evolve that and not be specific.
I have no problem with any of those changes. I just happen to think on the first page, round about, we'll call it 2/3 of the way down,
Yeah.
it's a paragraph that begins, to make location of policies easy, file name should be in the form of. That seems like a lot of detail, but this is an AR, and so I guess I'll leave to your.
It's unnecessary for us, especially with, as we transition, we'll start doing board docs, we can just strike that and have a consistent naming. Again, we'll look at housing them publicly on the website and utilizing board docs, but
Yeah, I
I'll
think,
double check with that naming convention to see if that would even still hold true.
yeah, that struck me as a technique that's used when you're looking in a Windows directory, but that's not where our public is
It's not
looking.
gonna be housed. And the other piece, again, this, we can make that change and make sure it's aligned with our transition to board docs. It doesn't need to come forward to the board, I just,
Sure.
as we were changing the other, wanted to talk about
Yeah,
it.
agreed, thanks.
Thank you. The next piece is 161. This was WASB language around board member authority, and we talked about really key concepts, but we did, and this is that language around, let's take a pen and make this some concise language where we can, but convey what we need to convey. And again, you think of the context of onboarding a new member or expected conduct, that kind of thing. And just a reminder, this is not a mandated policy, so we have a very liberal license to make it fit what we want to say in West Bend.
I know later in our policies, I
Mhm.
can't remember exactly what section or policy we have, but we have complaint policies.
Correct.
I don't know what numbers they are. You?
I'm gonna look at the exact ones. It probably sits in a couple spots.
And the reason I bring that up is because this policy, 161, starting on line 37 through 45, talk about receiving, investigating, and resolving complaints.
Mhm.
And so if we're going to continue with having complaint policies, which I'm sorry, I can't find right now,
Well,
should that even be in there?
here's the thing. I would make a recommendation then, as just a reminder, again, thinking about onboarding a new member. Hey, if I, as a board member, receive a complaint, and, it should be deferred to the superintendent,
Yeah.
and then leave it at that, and make it that lean. Because what you want is, again, a tool for board members, and then if you're navigating, and then our orientation for board members, and then here's the process by which you do complaints, but it's, I think it might be good also for the public, if they're looking at it like, well, I'm gonna call a board member, and they're gonna do this, it's also showing like, this is not in the scope of my authority.
Yep, I agree with that.
So maybe just that one sentence as a reminder, and see that or contact the,
I like that.
okay, then we'll do less is more and get.
Less
that
is
in there.
more on
Yep.
that, I suppose.
Yeah,
It's
it's just
policy
showing,
872, citizen complaints.
Oh, that's it, yes.
Yep.
That's part of the,
you can
when
put
we,
that reference.
when we do the people who make public appearances, as part of the script that we read, talk about if there's a complaint, this policy calls for it, that's
Right.
the one, Joel, you're right.
Anyway, less is more on that maybe,
Yeah.
and if you mock
Yeah.
something up, less is more, I'm
So-
still okay with having it brought to the board right away. I don't want to delay this from coming to approval, but
Yeah, let's just do the line, if an individual board member receives a complaint or other communications from a student, or receives a complaint, period. Or other communication, do we want to do that? I don't need it if it's other communication. We can,
Yeah, that other communication, what
yeah,
is
you get that all
that?
the time in the role of
Right,
your
sure.
board member. I think everyone understanding, no matter what format or who it's from, if there's a complaint there, that it should be referred to the district, to the superintendent, and I can even put a reference in there around that policy.
What did I say?
Yeah, I can
872.
I can put
Yeah, the submitter should be directed to
How to do it.
refer to policy 872 to file a formal
Yeah.
complaint.
There's nothing wrong, and then what I do is on our information, I'll keep that master list and it'll say there's a cross-reference here, so that if I ever touch 872,
Yeah,
this comes with it,
yeah,
so that I update it in some way.
that sounds good.
Sound good? Chris, did you forget your glasses? You're frowning.
I'm sorry?
Forget glasses, you're frowning at your screen.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's time to enlarge them.
Exactly, I was. Where's the zoom button?
Find it?
And again, we could do the same thing in the others, you know, there's so much of this that's governed by law, by other pieces. It can be as lean as we want.
We good on 161?
I don't know, Chris is still frowning and reading over there.
No, we're
Chris,
good.
things you want to take out? Okay.
No, we're good.
All right. Looking at 164, we're cleaning up that compensation and expenses. Ours just noted, you know, hey, that's taken care of at the annual meeting. This was the WASB language, and it just, you know, these pieces are approved by electors at an annual meeting. So again, it can be as small or large as we want. These are, if you look at the lines 25 through whatever where they're enumerating those are the statute pieces that they have the authority to do. It's not that we do them, but that's just showing the authority.
So one of the concerns that I had, I think it's addressed here, but let me just talk it through, was, you know, if I decided to attend a $5,000 conference without getting advance approval, the first portion of the policy, I think, addresses this nicely, which is beginning at line 12, a board member who incurs an expense, authorization was not expressly confirmed in advance, does so at his or her own risk. So I think that makes- Go
Also
ahead.
in 19, where it talks about any expenses incurred in their authorized participation.
That's it.
Something too.
That's good. Authorized participation. Thanks.
So if you go to a conference like that, at the next meeting of the electors, you could request for a repayment of that, but you might not get it.
Right, you don't have, so they have the ability to authorize those pieces. We would do that. We encourage board development. That's in another policy in the 100 series. But again, it's looking at some other pieces. It doesn't mean that you're waiting for the annual meeting to get your reimbursement. It means that you're authorized to do that. And again, it got at seeking pre-authorization. You're not, you know, going to a conference in Hawaii, doing those things, everything pre-authorized, and then you're subject to the same procedures that we would have for reimbursement of our own staff.
So getting into my wonky style consistency mode for a moment, on the bottom of page 1, points 1 and 2 refer to school board members, all lowercase. But then in 3, the reimbursement, whether full or partial, of a board, capital B, member for actual loss of earnings. And then there's, on line 35, there's another reference to board, capital B. Are those referring to different things, or is that just inconsistent?
No, that's just an oversight in the number 2. So the only time that you do a lowercase if it's preceded by an article. So when you precede it, that's the weird style thing. So that's when you're, the nuance of when is it school board, when is it board, when is board member.
Okay.
So we'll just clean up style. Thank you.
Mhm.
Good. With some of these cleanups, again, I still want these to come to the board for approval. I don't know that we need to necessarily bring them back to policy one more time. Are we okay with that?
Yeah, if it's making the cleanup items that we discussed, I'm fine having that go to the board. We'll have visibility there again anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll link it right here. This is what's going to the board, reflective of our conversation. So it's still staying here. People can follow our work. And then our board members will see that outcome. Then you can match it and you can speak to that. Looking at we're flying along. 165, we were looking at some different samples. We were looking at our current, and I cross-matched all of those for key concepts, because we talked about different styles, different samples. What you see is our policy language. I just shifted the preamble, that board members will strive to improve public education. To that end, they will. And these are our own pieces. The only thing that was nuanced in that collection of policies was around new learning. So new language would be informing themselves about current educational issues by individual study through participation in programs, providing needed information such as those sponsored by state or national school board associations. That was just covering new learning. That was the only missing concept. We can wordsmith that however we would like. But it was just staying informed. And it could be a shift in language. This was stock language where informing themselves. It can just be stay informed, because a lot of times maybe you're not taking the lead on it. We're making sure you have information. So it could just be the act of staying informed about current educational issues. Is that something you want?
Yeah, I like the concept of stay informed, because that means whether someone helps you with it or whether you seek it out yourself, either work and count.
Great. And then there were several different lines across the different, around making decisions. So all of ours, instead of vote on every issue that's before the board, some issues aren't votes. Sometimes maybe there'd be a reason for abstaining from a vote or things like that. So I wasn't sure about that language. Instead, I stole some language around just making decisions after you've done those things. So not shifting anything else. Just, it might not come to a vote on something, but it's around your decision making and being informed again. Again, that was our own language. Anything that we want to add, subtract?
Looks good to me.
I like those changes.
Okay, great. In looking at 165.1, this was the concept of a conflict of interest. We did not have something about a conflict of interest, but we did have a discussion around that as part of onboarding new members, or kind of that continued accountability to the role piece. And we're just talking about, again, there's legal pieces around incompatibility of office. We talked about personal interest.
I like that it's short and makes sense to me, reading it.
Yeah, I agree.
Great.
Likewise.
And then, and a lot of times, so I worked with other boards, and again, we didn't have this before, but sometimes I work with board members with different roles in their own corporations. They have to do certain disclosures annually around potential conflicts of interest. I'm sure, Chris, you deal with that in your organization. So it's just kind of that reminder and those pieces. And again, each spring, we kind of go over that 100 series as a refresh for veteran board members and an onboarding tool for new. 166, Tim Harder and I did a final review on this today. We were talking about some of the updated WASB language. You'll see we have some new language lines 27 through 34, just some updates from WASB language, and then getting rid of old language around file servers and things of that nature. We did talk about, at our last discussion, we talked about the nuance of social media and those pieces, and you know, Tim and I talked about it at length as well, around making sure our board members understand records and those pieces.
So 27 through 34, that's all new language?
Correct, in the
yeah.
yellow, that's just a new, pulled over from WASB, just as a good addition to what we had in place. Our policy was not woefully out of date in this case. I think under our direction from Tim Harder, who's in charge of all the technology pieces, he's kept this up to date as things shift.
Okay.
Any questions, anything you want to see that you want to tighten up, or any questions about those new lines?
I'm good with it.
Okay,
Good.
all right. In 171, we talked about kind of putting concepts together. So talking about board meetings, and in the title we could put regular board meetings or just leave it at board meetings because it's talking about other ones. So I would recommend we still strike that and say board meetings 171. And then we talked about how we schedule them, the location, public notice and proceedings, the agenda preparation and dissemination, the difference between a special meeting, a closed session, and minutes. So again, that was taking a lot of disparate policies, putting them together, getting them nice clean headings. So if I was wondering about board meetings, this was more kind of capturing that piece.
Yeah, I like the combination of the headings. I thought it's a good logical grouping, and like you said, it's kind of one-stop shopping if you're looking for just the basic elements around meetings and schedule, et cetera.
Yeah, there's, we're gonna get to another collection where we're looking to do the same thing, and there's a lot of overlap. So when we get back to that, I'm gonna kind of revisit, all right, how many spots do we wanna talk about how we do minutes? How many spots do we, you know, and my advice is always talk about it in one spot only if you can, because that interplay of when you touch something, it's a domino effect. So I'm gonna keep that there for reference and keep us moving. In 175, we were looking at that annual meeting date. So if I put in today's date, the lines 21 through 23, this is new updated language, so I didn't highlight the whole thing in yellow. But the concept of at our annual meeting date, at this next upcoming one, asking our electors to vote and authorize the district to determine a specific date and time of each subsequent annual meeting. And that gave us the flexibility to make sure there's readiness, we have, you know, the state budget's been resolved, those pieces with our annual meeting. So even though we would bring this forward, this would go in effect post the electors voting on that and providing that authorization.
I like it.
That's good.
And again, our electors, we can revisit that at any time and rescind that authority too. But you just always keep when historically did that occur in the policy as part of it. Great.
Going back to policy 171,
Yes.
under agenda prep and dissemination,
Mm-hmm.
I thought we had a policy that talks about if I want an item to be on the agenda, but the president says, no, I don't want that on the agenda, there was a process that a board member could go through to put that on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
It should, I think we have a policy like that. I'm pretty sure that we do.
Thought it was, it could be in the other piece. There is, and it's where you can,
And if,
put it in writing, it could be coming up in the 180s. You put it in writing and,
I request a vote at the next meeting.
correct.
Yeah.
It could be part of that 180 group to go in there, where I said there's pieces that
Yeah,
I think could still go in this one. So let's keep that
okay.
in your mind.
Oh, yeah, it's 171.2,
Yeah.
I think.
When you look at the 181 then, because we're gonna come out of order when we start talking about some other concepts. 181 is looking at those rules of order, and it's again reinforcing, you know, how we convene, how we act in that, and referencing Robert's Rules of Order as the established piece.
I'm sorry. What number are you looking at?
181. So we're gonna come back to your concept. There's gonna be some interplay across 180 and that, so. But I didn't want you to think I was missing 180, so that's why I said we're gonna be out of order for a hot second. So 181,
181.
which is right, follows right in order on this. It just appears like we accidentally put it on numerical order, but it was on purpose.
So just out of curiosity, the very first line, board president or in his or her absence, the vice president shall preside at all regular and special meetings and call meetings to order. I suppose it's possible, we have 7-member board. What would happen if the president and vice president are not there? There's still a quorum.
Yeah, you can put designate in this line so that you would go down the chain of, so I would just put board president in his or her absent, the vice president or designate shall preside.
I think that's
Because then if we know, then we would be like, hey, Paul's unable to make it, you know.
right, we wouldn't
We just
cancel
need
the
to
meeting.
designate whoever.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, I think just so that we have a trap door there just in case, because it could happen, and
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
hate to say, well, this meeting can't be held because everyone else is here, but 2 of us aren't.
Right.
Good catch. $181 look good?
Looks good.
This was revising an old one, getting it to the right number. That's all this revision was updating the title. 188 is actually board member participation in meetings via technology. It should be numbered as 188, and it's taking all of our content from what was previously, I think it was 181.5.
Yep.
So it was just aligning title.
Good with that one.
Okay.
Me too.
All right, then we're gonna go back and revisit in this collection of like 180, and as Joel was saying, this holdover on different votes, we kind of process. There's this catch-all of operating procedures. And what I did was it's a laundry list of language of our current, and then there's some different new language, and there's, again, this interplay of making sure we've got all our operations. Do we list them separately, or do we put them in board meetings? Where do they really need to be? So you think about key concepts, ballots, votes, records, right? This is, again, reinforcing what a quorum is. And then ballots, votes, and records is also just reiterating that you have the authority still, when you're voting for officers, that's the one time you can utilize a secret ballot process. So it still keeps it open for that. Is there any questions about ballots, votes, records?
No, I think that's okay. And this is going to show my ignorance of some of the super fine points of Robert's rules, but can we back up to line 8?
Yes,
Majority of the members of the affirmative vote of a majority of those members present having quorum should be considered sufficient for action. Hypothetically, we have a 7-member board. Let's say for some reason 4 have to abstain. That leaves 3. Can they take action? Because that's not a majority of the members present. It's members present. I'd have to look that one up. Maybe that's homework.
yeah,
And
I'll
it's
check with
very
WASB because I don't know in
I don't
what
know either.
circumstance we would have that authority.
I don't know, and that would be very unusual, but there have been times when people say, I'm not voting. I mean, you can,
Yep.
that's not been my experience on this board, but just seeing what happens at other boards from time to time, is something like that happen? That's a finer point, I don't want to drag on this conversation, we should just check into that.
No, but you have another piece around, if you have that and you can't carry it forward, rules of order, and then the abstention of a vote, there is no vote and you don't have that. But there is, so let's say there's a conflict, we're working on something, because everyone's really deeply rooted in the community, there could be a conflict, creating a conflict. There's a piece to visit maybe around committees, because committees cannot take action unless they're expressly authorized by the board to do so. So that may be that circular loop around a board, I would have this many, but if we've authorized a committee, we understand a conflict of interest, we do this, and we authorize in the scope of that committee work to vote
I see.
and take action on something, that could be a piece. Again, it's a far flung, but I'd rather have it attended to right now. So I can consult with, do we ship this? Do we make sure we have that piece? Because we're both thinking about it in different ways. Like I
Right.
said, just someone who wants to abstain, like I'm not voting, well, then you don't have what you need to carry forward,
Right.
per Robert's rules. But if there's a conflict that's going to create a problem for people to vote on something, how might we utilize that process? So it's a good thing to double check. Double check coming up when we talk about committees to see if we have that in there, and then I can go back to WASB and say, in our last conversation, this is what we came up with. And what I can do is I can link kind of that follow-up, so our public can see it and what that legal guidance gave us, and then we can determine, is there readiness to bring that forward? Do we want to?
Appreciate that. Sorry, I realize it's probably a rare bird for that to happen, and hopefully it never does, but
No,
just
but
in case.
as we said, we've seen unique experiences in communities, and we'd rather be prepared.
Can we look at lines 13 through 20?
Mhm.
I don't know if it's just the wording on this, but I don't totally understand what we're trying to get at here. 13 through 15 is no secret ballot voting unless it's the election of officers of the board.
Which we say that in the officer policy. That's the only one by statute that's allowed. So this is saying like, hey, unless the statute allows you, you can't vote by secret ballot.
Okay, what does line 16 through 18, what are we getting at there?
So you have to take a vote and we have to affirm it and we have to record it in some way. And that's a big thing. Again, you also don't need to have any of these pieces. So what do we want to say here that's
Yeah.
clear for us and for our public?
Yeah, I think what that means, Joel, is that, you know how we normally say, all right, all in favor say aye, opposed, no, or maybe there's one or two no. You can, any member of the board can say, Mr. President, I request a roll call vote. And every person then has to individually recount their vote. I think that's what that calls for.
Or show of hands. And
Show of hands.
Just not secret ballot.
Yeah, because it has to be ascertained, meaning you can identify who voted yes or no.
Okay.
And then recorded means then it's put in the minutes, so I think that's what that means.
We have election of officers clearly stated, so as Joel's saying, and again, we're hurting no one's feelings, we're taking legal language and we're
Yeah.
putting this together. So
Do we need?
do we just say any member of the board may require that a vote taken at any meeting in such manner that the vote of each member is ascertained and recorded? So you can ask for a roll call, or do we just want to say, you can ask
Ask
for a roll call
vote.
vote at any time?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
I think, yeah, we
That makes it a little more clear.
any board
simpler to
member,
understand. No, that's good.
and that's what we want. Any member of the board may require, may request, require,
Request.
request, roll call vote taken at any meeting. Right?
Right.
Okay. All right, any other questions about, and again, remember, like, as little or as much as we want, or not even have any of this. The next was around legal responsibility, and this was our language, but we have pieces about minutes in the other one. We have pieces about proceedings in the other one. We talk about access to. What this one got into a lot more than the other was the minutes of closed sessions. So we have that other policy that we've talked about, and we have minutes in there. Do we want to take any more language and talk about minutes regarding closed sessions more specifically and shift it over to that policy so it's all together? That was the one piece that stuck out to me was the, this is again our current language.
So, less is more. The section on minutes of closed session seems awfully long. Is a lot of this coming from state statute?
So this was our past, if you take a look, keep scrolling down and hit the yellow parts, right there. This is WASB's updated language. So all the previous was our, some of key concepts from our own language. So we talked about voting, when secret ballots can be used, how you do that. And then it talks a little bit more about board minutes. So I think we just need to dig into this and what do we want to say and where do we want to say it?
Do you have to approve minutes of closed sessions within 45 days of the meeting, or is that statute, or is that is statute?
Yeah, you wanna do that within the same timeline.
The WASB stuff is in yellow.
Correct. That's their language about voting methods and minutes.
So the WASB stuff in yellow does call out closed sessions, special meetings, regular meetings, and closed sessions. So, and the section in yellow, I kind of like the section in yellow better than what we've got now.
I do too, it's pretty concise. And then just the pieces, you kind of hone in on that. We had that other policy, remember earlier, that talked about minutes. And do we want to shift that there? Do we want to take minutes out of here? That was in that operational piece. Kind of where do we want those pieces?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Where is it presently?
So 171, remember we said, oh, we need to set aside because there's this weird commingling that's gonna start happening across some of these, so we gotta update them both. So right now, 171 has a piece in minutes, the very last lines, 88 through 91. It's a lot less than this. Would you like to see board minutes stay in some operating procedures, stay under board meetings?
I think it makes sense to have minutes at the bottom of 171 when you're talking about the meeting. You're gonna have schedule, the location, the notice, the agenda prep.
Yeah, so transfer that language to 171. We can do the same thing with voting methods. You know, you can push that into board meetings and talk about comprehensive policy that then says, how do we schedule, how do we do this? We'll fix the agenda piece when we get to it, but how would they vote on things? You can push those concepts together as well, because there's no mandate around this, so we really have that. Again, I'm just looking at it from a ease and use for our public. I don't want them to have to shop multiple policies to try and find information.
Yeah.
If we can consolidate this and get it as tight, where it's like, hey, here's all the things that kind of have to do with building a board meeting.
Right.
Maybe it's best served under board meetings.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I like the idea too, that all, tough to always use the word all, but all the information about minutes all goes into
Okay.
one spot.
Agreed.
I think it's comprehensive for board minutes. I think it's broken down, so it's not, you know, kind of taking a look at a whole thing, and it's getting at the different types. It's all current practice, there's no shift in practice. The only thing to affirm is, we currently have them signed by the board clerk, that we would want to stay with that as practice, but it gives you, again, that 45-day timeline, all those pieces. So I would list this section, and I'm going to put it to 171 in minutes. Okay? So then we go back to the concept of voting. Do we want to make any kind of thing, or do we want to relabel this on voting? Do we want to, how would we like to tackle that concept? Because we can do the same thing.
So presently, voting is in policy 180, I'm looking at, let's see, line 12.
Lines 12 through 20, and we just tighten that up ourselves. I mean, I think our language in 13 through 20, barring, you know, how we just shifted it, is pretty concise, pretty self-explanatory, unless there's something you want.
One item that I did like in the highlighted language was close to the first part, which was the reminder that you have to take roll call vote on, and it's got those 4 pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4.
The only thing that we would add is our policy when we have someone participating virtually, that we
Right.
also include that, so I would update that. And then I would, as a formatting, I would list those much like these are.
Yes,
So
Pull
it's
it
just
in.
more clear and concise to read.
so it's pulled out.
And then I'll make sure, does it say that at any time a board member can request a roll call vote?
Yes,
Mhm.
line 130,
Okay.
line 132.
Okay, just so we've got that, because that was what was important to us when we were looking at our language. So with the exception of the formatting, where we're gonna fix those line items, take the language from voting methods. Again, then the question is, do you want it in a standalone policy? Do you want it incorporated into board meetings?
I don't know why I couldn't go into board meetings.
I think so too.
I think it's an easy,
It's logical.
I'm wondering
grouping.
about, yeah, I think so too. So then I'm taking the language recommended by WASB, updating ours, and just fixing this format so it's more easily read. Keeping headings. Do you have any preference in the placement of these concepts in that policy 171? Right now, we talk about schedule, location, how we notice it, how the agenda is prepared, and then it gets into different meetings and minutes. Is there any? So you're looking at 171, taking these key concepts, moving them there.
Would it not make more sense to almost have your meeting type up at the beginning,
They can.
talking about, regular board meetings, special board meetings, closed session, and then you go through your schedule,
Sure.
et cetera, et cetera. It seems like, the definition or the construct of the meeting itself is kind of the highest level.
Yeah, I like that, because otherwise, well, it starts with, on line 14, except as otherways determined, et cetera. The board will hold regular meetings at least once a month. Well,
What's a regular
what's
meeting?
What's-
regular
what's
meeting?
reg-
It's really- So, I like that.
Okay. So we're gonna take special, closed, et cetera, move those to the top to lead with those pieces.
So the schedule, location, public notice, agenda. I'd say minutes probably comes next because it's important that you understand what needs to be done, and then boom, voting. Here's how we govern ourselves.
Mhm. So we're looking at those pieces, we've got that, we're good. So I'm taking these, putting theirs in there, and then we're going through the kind of key concepts. It was a collection of the 170s and the 180s that constitute kind of operational things. So then we're going through and looking at agenda. We had quorum present. I'm just going through the list of all those other concepts to make sure, because I think this is that one nice vehicle. If we can keep it really nicely organized, where it makes sense. We have the concept on preparing the agenda. We have that, and then you have meeting agenda. It's around the concept around if an individual board member or a committee chairperson acting on behalf of a board committee disagrees with a decision not to include a particular item of business on the agenda for a particular meeting, such person may insist that the next regular meeting of the board include an agenda-setting topic where the board as a whole may decide when, if at all, that's what Joel was talking about. Now, in our meeting, one thing that we do, and I don't know that it expressly says that, is there's always an item around upcoming business, and that's where we're soliciting from boards. We've had public input, we've had that around putting that on our future agendas. Do we want to put that out more specifically in that there's always a space on that agenda? That's something that we're currently doing and in attention to, but that could shift if we don't so state it in here around those agendas. And then, as you said, all right, if it's not amicable, there's no agreement, then what's the resolution on this? So if you look at and just review the agenda prep and dissemination, that is something unique that we're doing in kind of future forecasting.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you could say the idea of a board member having to insist that there be an item placed on the agenda to consider a future agenda item, we have that. Well, and I guess the law doesn't require it, but that is our practice. So I think what you're saying is, well, maybe we should just document that practice, because as long as that's there, then this issue somewhat solves itself if that's a required
And it gets-
element of each agenda.
Right, so there's that piece where we're already doing it, so we construct a sentence around that, and then the same concept around, so if we sat there in a meeting and we did that, and said, items for future consideration, right? And we said that publicly in a board meeting, right now, our board is really good about looking at things, but again, you can watch other board meetings, not ours. And there's a different intention there. So while we sit here and think, like, we wouldn't agree or disagree on that. So then, when they say that, and we're asking for future items, it's still reviewed? Is it automatic in there? So it's a reviewed item, and if, again, we're right now looking at the superintendent and the board president, we're hearing these things, we're co-creating the agenda, then if it's not, is that the process we want to go with? So I'm going to say something explicitly around agendas include an opportunity for future agenda items, consideration of future agenda items, and then the what if scenario.
What if it's denied?
What if it doesn't show up? So we say it,
Yeah.
and we all nod our heads at the meeting, and Chris and I affirm the agenda, and you look at it, it's like, well, you didn't put that on there.
Right.
Yeah, that's,
That's true, because what we usually use that as an input session, and yes, you're right, I think in our, the way that we conduct board meetings, I've never known any of those not to show up on an agenda, but thinking about, okay, what if there is conflict? And we don't call, or I haven't called for, all right, is there a motion and a second to approve these as future agenda items? We don't do that. I guess we could if there was some disagreement, but you're right, otherwise it would be, someone brings it up, we all nod our head, and then, Chris decides, I'm not putting that on the agenda, and that doesn't show up.
Right.
At that point, I suppose their remedy is to, to make a motion in support of an agenda item at a future meeting, but now weeks have gone by,
Right.
probably.
Yeah,
That is something we should think about, because although it's not a problem today, you talk about kind of future proofing. That's a good one, that's an interesting one.
Right, and a lot of times, and again, we're really gonna, it doesn't mean it's coming up on the next agenda. It might go to committee, it might be getting more information, it might be like, oh, we need a couple weeks before we can bring that, let us dig into it and bring it back kind of thing to a discussion. So it's not that it has to be right at the next agenda in the future, but should it come back, so right now, it's stating if you disagree, right, you can insist that the next regular meeting include agenda-setting topic, where the board as a whole may decide when, if at all, it's going to be calendared for future discussion, or refer that for further evaluation to committee or administration. So what it's formalizing is, if it doesn't show up and there's conflict, then setting future agendas needs to come up as an action item.
I know it's never happened since I've been here, but it would happen in the case of a board member who's got a major opinion on something like, I want to combine the high schools. I think we should combine the high schools, and I want that on the agenda at our next meeting. And the president and the superintendent say, no, we're not, as a school district, we're not ready for that, we gotta do a bunch of research. No, I want it on. You know?
Well, that's a nice case, because I'd say now we're actually in violation of board policy, so I wouldn't do it.
but still.
Well,
But you can have that where you're doing that, and it's, as you said, it's a, maybe a personal interest, passion project, et cetera,
Right.
and it either doesn't belong there or whatever. So I think that process is an opportunity to have input for future agenda items, as part of our meetings. And then if it does not, if someone disagrees. So I'm taking offense to this, maybe it's me with wordsmithing, but a person may insist that the next, I don't think you need to insist. I think it's just the process is that the next, board meeting would have an opportunity to discuss agenda preparation with action
Right,
on it.
yeah, right, so let's see if we're on the same page. So the way we're currently doing it, which I appreciate, is at the tail end, we have that just general input session. We don't do motion seconds on that, will be on the agenda, because it wasn't an agenda item to approve, so we can't take
Correct.
action. That's informational to inform us as to when we set the next agenda. If somebody says, I want topic X on the agenda, we don't do it, then, if they request, I think you're right, we force, is the wrong word, but I'll use we're forced to put on the agenda an action item around setting agenda.
And to me, I don't think, because let's say we got to that, this should be really, so I don't need the insist piece.
Right.
So let's say, Joel's, I want item X, and we're saying, oh, that's actually a committee, or it's this, or we need lead time on that, or we were talking about this, and, because that's generally how we work through it now, but let's say Joel is disgruntled at that, like, no, I want this here. I don't think we should wait then for the next meeting for him to have to make an assistant, if that's not happening, we don't have resolution on that, then it automatically, it goes on the next agenda as part of process and practice. So it doesn't get to a contentious point. You don't have lapse time. Right now, we're meeting with the board every 2 weeks, so we don't have that lapse. So I think it then, just part of that interplay with the board president and superintendent, if you have that, you know, and we're not going to, it automatically becomes an agenda item for discussion and action. But that's, again, dictating a process versus them. I just think it's weird that we would force them to insist that. And, you know, but also I like the ball in their court around, they need to request that
Right.
too. Or do we do it automatically, or do we force them to request? I guess it's the operational piece.
And we have
Of
that, right, we have the action item around approval of the agenda, which I realize means you can only bring forward what the public has been notified about, which appears on the agenda, although in theory, you could have discussion at that point where someone would say, I want on a future agenda, topic X. Yeah, I don't mean to make it overly complicated, but
And I
that
don't mean
is.
to either,
No,
I
No,
remember
but you-
this.
No, this,
It
I've
goes
seen
on all
this,
around you. Watch other board meetings, so.
we should tackle that
Yeah, it
and
should
make it
be.
clear.
So I would say that it should be requested as part of the next agenda. That gives them space, it gives them some ownership too around making the request and not us presupposing anything as superintendent and board president. So I'm gonna write it as request, that they would request that agenda, you know, setting a future agenda include as a discussion and action item.
Which would be, by our present practice, would take place at that tail end agenda item that we have.
Yeah, so they would, and they could make that request right there, and it's done, or they could make it in the interim, like, hey, I didn't see this on the agenda. I want you to, now I need you to do this. But forcing the request to come from the person, is that okay as part of the process? We don't do it automatically, that they should request that?
Do they have to request it to be put on the agenda?
Yeah, they can make a request.
And the idea would be, if they requested it, that it would be then on the agenda.
Versus us automatically putting it on.
Right, right, right.
You know,
Right.
so let's say, I pick on Joel, he's sitting next to me.
Yeah, that's all right.
But, you know, Joel, it's not, no, I want, here's our reasons why he's not accepting of the rationale for that. He could make the request somewhere in that 2 weeks before we meet again, you and I on our next agenda, like, no, we don't have a resolution here, we need it on the next agenda item. But it's originated by a request, it doesn't have to be waiting for him at the table, he just originates a request. I don't put any scope around, he has to give it to me in writing, or it has to be made before the
Right.
board, or anything like that. As an, we've had this as a request to put on the agenda to talk about future, specifically around X, have a discussion, and then you're going into the Roberts rules around if it
There's no support.
if it has no support, it doesn't go forward.
Guys,
Yeah,
So,
that's fine.
I think that's fine.
okay.
I like that. That's a simpler approach, and it doesn't look like, okay, I have to go through 2 months, so, yeah,
Yeah, and the timeliness and
Right.
all of those.
I like that.
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna mock up that language. I'm gonna have WASB take a look at it for me. Just so it's meeting that, and again, they're gonna be more well-informed around other boards who might not be as functional,
Right.
you know, with just those what-if scenarios. Have them look at that. Hopefully I can get that turned around to this committee, linked in here, so the public can view it as well. But I bring that forward then as part of that. So then we're really looking at this 171 again, and we put voting methods in it and minutes in it, and now how do we really build agendas, when times are good, when times are bad? Are there any other pieces about board meetings that we would think? When you look at, like I said, some of those operational pieces in the 180s, where we talked about closed sessions, we've got that now in here. Quorums, we've already talked about what constituted a quorum, different procedures, the minutes, those concepts. Did we attend to those? Do we have, I think the format is really nice
Yeah.
in this.
Yeah, it's more one-stop shopping. I like it.
So would you're suggesting put not everything, but any of those themes that are in the 180s, put them also in the not
Those-
also, but you put them in 171 and get rid of some.
The voting, the minutes, I would get rid of this and just take the voting and the minutes. We talk about what our legal responsibility, our authority, we're talking about that in all sorts of places, but again, everything around kind of the meeting and operation is really in a nice tight location. We're just gonna reorder it and clean up those pieces.
I like
And again, I'm just reiterating the concepts, it was concepts of quorum, concepts of, just going through that list. It was agenda prep, dissemination, special board meetings, closed sessions, quorums, different procedures for the meeting, which we had, I think we've attended to all of those key concepts in a nice way to navigate for our public and for our board. Any other considerations as we kind of put this 170, 180 to bed? Okay, great, I will clean that up, I'll get that turned around right away. Tomorrow I'll get it linked here for the public, but I'll send it to you directly as well, so you can review it, make sure, and that way, as we kind of get the nuance of the next agenda, we can feel confident in including it.
Sounds good.
It's representative of discussion. Like,
There's
guess what I'm doing tomorrow?
There's a lot in both of those, so thank you for getting them all together and
Yeah, that's
going through it.
Yeah, that's an action-packed one.
You know what, it's really good work, and when you think about it as a board member, like, oh, this is what we do, this is how we do it, it's really good guidance and helpful, and written in a manner that's accessible to our public and meaningful, so. And, you know, we love our board, but sometimes people are interested in pursuing public office and something, and it's a nice spot to go like, oh, this is what it's all about, you know, because like you said, I'm sure you don't want to be 90 and still serving on a board. So it's helpful recruitment, it's helpful, you know, for future board members.
Yep.
Other people will now steal it from us and copy it. We'll see it pop up because I think it's really well done in a lot of key concepts without it being 14 extra policies.
Yeah.
Okay, so that takes us through that concept of kind of 180s, 170s, all those. Now we're going back, jumping into 185. And this was one of those, it's currently suspended because it was really detailed around things. And we talked about, same thing, key concepts. There were committees, there's work sessions, there was also ad hoc, but the ad hoc, when you read it, that looked like other just district committees, and it had voting things, so it was like, all right, when do we have which? So again, that top part, the preamble, is our current language with a couple strike-throughs around holding us to 6 separate committees and what they were. But it's just talking about the board may operate by committee as well. And when is that time? And then I put in the new language using some WASB recommended language in yellow, and then just the rest is all of our very detailed about those different committees and structures.
Which are struck now.
Yep, and again, this is part of the reason I think that this policy has been sunset right now.
Yeah.
It's so overly detailed, it doesn't represent current practice, nor does it give you the flexibility for practice. If you look at this, try to get in there that the annual board committees are something that you talk about. We do that as part of reorganization. Remember, we talked about, here's our structure for committees, and here's delegates, whether you're, Paul's the CISA delegate, Joel, you're a WASB delegate. We do that slate when we reorganize. So does the language give us the flexibility and help people understand what the concepts are?
Yeah, I support the striking of it, because on the one hand, it's nice to know historically what we've done, but when I look at these, at least the way in the private sector, when we're looking at the governance, for instance, of our board and our committees, this looks like committee charters. So the idea is, perhaps what we can do is when we're establishing a committee, we should set the charter at that point in time, because then that committee is doing what they're designed to do, rather than come up with these and just park them and let them age. So,
Right, so, I mean, and then take a look then at that new language of committees, as you said, you're still, you know, we can't have rogue committees of the board pop up, you're still, the board is setting that scope, you're talking about them annually, you're doing those, you have flexibility to bring them up if you need to, but do we have then the process, maybe we need a formalized committee in between the annual one, do we have that here? So let's take a read and think about all those weird scenarios, not just annual ones, but maybe a pop-up, do we have that flexibility?
well, and also on line 14, well, the end of 13 and into 14, the committee's membership structure and charter shall be subject to annual review by the full board. So it's calling for a charter there, which the way I look at it is, well, this is what this committee is authorized or designed to do, or expectations.
Mhm. Instead of the word charter, can we put purpose?
I'm fine with that.
Charter is really, like you said, that's gonna call forth a different mental model.
Yeah,
And to
and
me, when we do that organization, a couple lines around what's the purpose of this committee, and we kind of discuss that charge.
I think that's fine, because we've not, correct me if I'm wrong, we've not historically created a separate document called a charter for each committee. Because I think you're right.
Yeah, it's got all this detail.
To me, it sounds like instead purpose would be better. I think that's what was therefore meant, and
And again, this is language that our district created, and it could be that influence, like you said, of a little bit of a business model, and a different mental model kind of getting infused with education, so. But I think that, again, you want it to come for the board. In line 18, this is current language. I would recommend if we keep any of this language, again, we can make these policies as lean as we want. At a committee, while you're not a member of the committee, I found it unusual that they would take part in discussion and express opinions as part of a committee, if they're not on it. So you can come and you can watch, but I found that very unusual. It's
Yeah.
like getting a de facto committee member.
well,
I thought a committee should be more of that fishbowl.
Yeah.
And you are absolutely welcome to come to anything to help build your background knowledge, but your opinion and all that is going to come at the board table.
Well,
Is where that's coming.
that is an interesting point, because take this committee, so there are 3 of us here. So let's say, I'm just making up, Nancy Justman was here participating as well and expressed opinions. Isn't that a walking quorum at that
Right.
point in time?
So I just thought, I'm like, what is this? So, you know, a committee is a fishbowl. We have a process, we have agendas, we have all of those things. And all board members are welcome to come to anything to build their background knowledge. But as we said, that there's to avoid quorum, to avoid like a completely different, you weren't authorized to be on that committee. That should go to the board table
Yeah.
when those items come forward.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, you know, if another board member wants to come, you know, sometimes it might be nice to hear about what they're thinking, so that we're not putting something in front of the board that's going to just, you know, fall flat on its face. However,
But yeah,
future proofing and thinking about it, I think for the purpose of good orderly conduct of these meetings, I think that's a good
And,
thing
and,
to add.
and this is our language, this is some of the WASB language, let's take a look at this pieces, are we getting at it 2 ways, are we getting at it?
I don't think there's anything in the WASB language on that.
My recommendation would be that we, as you have suggested, that we take that language out, that we strike it. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to ask WASB if that's a problem or not, I mean, I just, you know what, I just.
This
I
is
think
our
it's
own
more orderly.
language, this is
Yeah.
something we made up.
Where does it, I don't think it talks about it in here, but should it talk about how a committee is formed? Like, how do you go about, you know, it talks about the functions of a committee, the value of committees.
45, members of each standing committee shall be appointed annually by the board president. So we did that as part of the spring organization, but that's what I was saying, what I don't, I'm not sure that it speaks to is, what if we needed a pop-up committee of some kind? But to me, when you think about those things, let's take our, I'm trying to think of my work in the past where I needed a work session. We were looking at enrollment, we were looking at school closure. I don't have a designated committee, but I'm popping that up through a work session. I'm convening a work session, and board member attendance is expected at work sessions, because that's a session of the full working board on that. And the rest, you know, what would you need a pop-up committee for outside of that annual designation and that process that you would not accomplish? If something is so, I mean, like, wouldn't we then utilize the work session format? And the question is to you as board members around, does this fit the needs of standing committees, flexibility, they don't have authority, everything's gotta come back before the board, right? And that's an approved process annually. And then work sessions are more of those kind of pop-up pieces. It's still, but that's where all board members are there. There's nothing that precludes you from putting it as an agenda item. Let's say disgruntled Joel's like, hey, I want this committee. You know, we'd have to put it on and have the board vote on it. You know, I don't think anything in the language, Chris, you'd be more knowledgeable in that, around committees, even though it says annually and all those, we could do a one-liner on it. It doesn't preclude us from
Right.
the board, the full board authorizing a committee within the year.
Right.
Some kind
I
of line
guess
around that.
that is kind of what I'm getting at is, you know, does the board president and superintendent say, okay, well, this year we're gonna have a policy committee and a curriculum committee? And within 30 days of the annual election, the board president will make those appointments to those committees. I
Right.
mean, how do you even determine what the committee is? And, I mean, it talks about how it's determined who's on the committees. Suppose that's an appointment by the board president, but
So if you recall it was 1 or 2 meetings leading up to our reorganization. I talked about what current committees we had, what their structure was, who the delegates were. That was part of that reorganization process. So first we drew attention to those roles and then all those pieces. To me, in that discussion item, before we did that, that's what would come forward. But as you're saying, we're really functional and
Right.
we're doing that, and you don't want to not have an avenue. So is it that it's discussed annually? You know, a little more flexibility in the language instead of just the committees for the upcoming year are discussed and approved by the board, and then that whole, right? Because then if it doesn't get on the agenda, and it doesn't get, you know, because then we make that an action item to approve those things before we go into who's sitting in what seat.
Yeah, I think the way I've interpreted that is on an annual basis, I guess I use the word force, but we're forced to discuss, here are the committees that we want, and here are the people that we want on them, and that's fine, but that doesn't preclude us 3 months down the road of, oh, there's a need for another committee, popping it up at that point in time. It's just that at that annual cadence, whatever committees are around, and whatever we maybe think we need at that point in time,
Right.
we discuss. And that's potentially is the time that somebody could say, well, that's fine, that, you know, Chris, that you want a curriculum committee and a policy committee, but I think we need a
Yeah.
whatever committee. That's
I'll get
a
a
time
line.
to discuss it.
Yeah, I'll get a line from them around authorizing those within the year as well, so we're not, and then that it's an annual discussion and approval around what committees for the
Right.
upcoming year, that appointment structure, and those, still holding work sessions. And then, again, my nuance that I pushed in was a work session, that is, you expect all board members to be at a work session and part of that.
yes.
That's a working session of the board, so I did put that in there around your attendance is expected there.
So where does a committee of the whole fall under what heading?
So you operate, there's the, there's so many numbers, where it talks about, I think, board meetings, where it talks about you are operating as a committee of the whole. Now, there's one thing that we've done a little differently here. So sometimes when we don't have this, 6 standing committees and all this, you do operate as a committee as a whole. That, I'd have to look at what number that was, declares that. sometimes, and you've noticed this rhythm of our meetings, where at the top of the month, we're treating it like committee of the whole, more discussion, and then coming before the board, so that you've got all the information you need, so that next meeting is, your board meeting where you're taking action. Both are labeled as board meetings, so that action can occur within them, because you try and
Action
reserve.
could occur.
At both of our board meetings that we have each month, the way they're labeled is that they are, again, you're functioning as a committee of the whole, but it's labeled as a board meeting, so that action can occur wherever.
Because work sessions can't have action items.
You
post it.
Yeah, if you post it and it's authorized by that, you can, but you try and steer a committee, a separate committee, not committee of the whole,
Right.
but a separate committee, diminished authority, right? They're digging into something, they're recommending all of that. Committee of the whole has authority to it, but there's cadence to the action of it. I wouldn't label that agenda committee of the whole and push action. They try and have you at your board meeting, that's where action is. So that's why our 2 meetings, we function as a committee of the whole. And I have to look at which one that says, where it says specifically we function as a
It's
committee
line
of the
8
whole.
on 185, line 8.
Yeah, 8, 9, okay.
Yeah, and I guess I never thought about it that way. The implication of that is
Mhm.
that, yeah, for really all regular and special meetings, we're basically just a big old committee of the whole, which makes sense.
Mhm.
But by virtue of the posted agenda, we've slated action items.
Mhm. And I think it's, like I said, do you think, and this is talking about committees and that structure, do you think this has enough clarity? Does it add to the confusion? Do we need to
On 185.
talk about different types of board meetings? Because remember, we have that other policy where we're talking about types of board meetings. Is there cross-reference there?
And it's interesting, right, because we have regular meetings of the board, right? We have special meetings of the board.
And we label those 2-time monthly ones, we're bound minimally to meet once a month, right? We have 2, but they're labeled as regular so that action can occur.
Because really, I guess in the grandest sense, do we need committee of the whole if we've got regular meetings and we have special meetings? I mean, it's just a special meeting, it's just we've decided as part of the agenda, we're not taking action. Because I don't know that we want to bind ourselves to say a committee of the whole can never, ever, ever take action.
Right.
So we don't want that.
No, and this gives you, when you talk about committees, doing that, we don't have it declared as committee of the whole segregated in there, and even this gives you flexibility. It's like, yeah, well, you try not to take action, the committee might be authorized by the board, whatever, you're making an assumption that a committee is a smaller grouping of your board
Right.
versus that committee of the whole. So I think that nuance of a committee of the whole, I think what that is, but is it plain language, I think is, the more you look at words, the less sense they make sometimes, right? Or the more you hyper-focus on one word.
Yeah, I wonder if that line 8-9 where it talks about committee of the whole, that that's more the, how do I want to say it, that's more the effect as opposed to literally where we say that our term of our committee of the whole.
And
I
that
think what it means is, this is where the board gets together and how we have authority. I think they mean it in the general sense, not necessarily the literal sense.
And you look at this is, that part that you're referencing, the committee of the whole concept, is homegrown language and originated in the 80s, 1980. So is it time to remove that because now it's just throwing another competing thing? Because we are bound by statute on how we prep an agenda, how we do all those things. Is it muddying the waters?
Yeah, I wonder, I think it's just adding confusion. Why can't we start with the board president shall appoint standing committees? I mean, this is about committees, and we take that out, which is redundant. Because nothing else, it's talking about regular and special meetings of the board. Well, that's not a committee, anything.
Right? So kind of striking that first paragraph, but keeping that concept of annual review, purpose, discussion, and approval, right? So we believe committees, I would take under committees in the yellow language, that very first lines 26 through 29, that feels more like some preamble language,
Mhm.
right? So I could take lines 26 through 29, then the concept of, hey, annually, we're gonna discuss and approve the committees for the upcoming year, and get that in there, and then, when it comes to committee as a heading, standing committees are gonna do this. And then, I will take the line in the preamble part, and put in there, it doesn't preclude us from during the year adding a committee, or
Right.
something like that. But put that more as the preamble, take this out,
Mhm.
pull up kind of the concept that we want, and then keeping that committee and, work session language. Does that feel,
Yeah, I'd like to see a draft like that. That would-
Perfect.
Yeah,
I will draft that.
okay.
Good times. 187, public participation at board meetings. We went through, this is WASB sample language, looking at just encouraging, and we talked about, how do we determine the time limit, and what about if it's extending beyond, 45 minutes, and those things, and I've seen that this year in people, boards
Oh,
having
yeah.
to extend their own public comment. All those, but it's, again, this is a board that encourages public, to watch our meetings. We're putting those out there to participate in those, and have public participation at our board meetings.
The only thing I think that's missing from the WASB language I guess I want everyone's opinion. Our old policy states who can speak at our meetings. The WASB language makes it sound like any member of the public, which could include someone visiting from Florida that wants to come speak and they're not a resident.
So who is that?
And so our old policy,
It said residents of the district, employees of the district.
Yep.
It's part of the script.
I will grab that language and put defining that who from our. And then the one question I had is, so we have that scheduled at the beginning, and we have it at regular and special board meetings. So we have minimally one regular board meeting a month. Right now we have 2. We have public comment, doesn't come before committees, but you saw tonight, we just had a special committee, and we made sure to put public comment on there. Do you want that practice to continue? Because sometimes boards just put it at their regular board meetings, or others do.
I think it
Was-
needs to be on there because, tonight's special board meeting, it was certainly just consent type stuff, but you could have a meeting that's a special meeting called where it's a big deal and the public will want to weigh in. So I personally like that.
Excellent.
And then it's under our current policy, it's under participant responsibilities, it's qualified participants, residents, employees, and parents of the district.
As a parents.
I would recommend changing the word parents to parents guardians,
Yes.
so it's more inclusive. Other than that, I'm gonna pick that up and bring that into this.
And the rest of our current policy, I don't know that it needs to be in the new one, but I think there are some good practices in there, like filling out the comment card, the script that you read. That is in our policy. I don't think it needs to be, but I think it can be a practice we just simply continue.
Or do you want it? I mean, it's not harming us to have it in here. I think it comes down to the organization of it visually, putting that in, and we can give ourselves some more, this is the general process. But, we've had questions around our process this year when it came to the public comment part. And we could lean on policy. Do you want something like that? And again, I've seen many meetings, in other districts, not our own, where, they're having to really provide some order in the room, and there's nothing that precludes us from having it. Or do you want it as a separate, here's how we generally do it? It doesn't.
Yeah, I think this is something that is very important and could become publicly contentious if it's misunderstood. And so I think the more that we have it laid out, the better. I'm envisioning something like maybe at the tail end of the policy, kind of like we have with our other policy, kind of the procedural discussion, the same stuff that if we printed that out and gave it to, you know, and laid it out on the table, that if someone picked up and said, okay, here are the steps, you gotta fill out a public comment card, the president is gonna call you forward, you get 3 minutes to speak, that kind of stuff, you
Do we
know.
want it in, as part of policy, or do we
Yes.
want it as an administrative rule?
Let's see.
Now, here's what I think.
Okay.
I'll give you what I think.
Okay,
There is no harm in putting it in actual policy if it's written flexibly enough. I think that this is a function of the board. The board has delegated ARs to the administration to support policy, but you know, I would be bringing that, I'm not bound to bring it forward, but if I were touching that AR, that is so solidly the board's function to hear from its public and constituents.
yeah, I think that's it's again, such an important, it could be sensitive topic, I'd put it in the policy, because then it has board visibility.
I agree.
We can point to it and, no offense, but maybe the public's like, oh, well, this is an administrative rule, well, what's that? As opposed to, well, this is a board policy. I mean, that's kind of the highest level of governance, really.
Well, and as we said, not only highest level of governance, but one-stop shopping. If you're looking for something, don't make them run around all
Yeah.
over to understand its clarity. So to me, just looking at that, putting together some procedures at the end, you know, here's the importance of public input, and then here's the process.
It sounds like we may not even need to be changing our current policy.
Well, I was just looking at it and talking about how, you know, at the beginning, you've got total public participation time of up to 30 minutes. This time may be extended by a simple majority vote of the board. There's your flexibility. The AR is to give administration flexibility without having to come back to the board to make a change. Well, the only time public participation applies is when the board is present anyway.
Correct.
So AR is kind of silly.
I appreciate the WASB example here, but I think the kind of the way our discussion is going,
We can hold with ours.
maybe we don't even change the policy at all,
That's beautiful.
so.
Those are the easiest ones to make.
Let me ask one question, and I am totally fine at each meeting reading the board president's announcement. We come to the public participation portion of our agenda. You know, my thought was, we have the public comment cards. I wonder if we supply those instructions in writing.
It's not necessary to do that. I've not seen that level of explanation given as part of
Yeah, I mean,
meeting. You just are usually saying, we've come to that portion.
right,
And just as we did tonight in the meeting that preceded this, we're helping our audience participate by, I haven't received any cards, but is there anyone who would like to speak? So even if they don't have to come in having done their homework or knowing, we're helping them participate and helping them do that, and trying to connect with people. We're always giving that opportunity, so.
When I was sitting in that chair, I typically look at the room, and if it's someone that has come to meetings in the past, I would stop reading it. I would just say, you know, hey, you know, I recognize you, and you've done this in the past, you know the policy, come on up, you got 3 minutes, you know?
And the preamble is really around anyone who wishes to speak, right? And then we help them with process. I don't have any cards for speaking. Is there anyone who wishes to speak? That's all you really need
Right.
in that when you're calling forth that.
well, and that was my point, that, you know, perhaps we can change that to say that, you know, the board president, when coming to that agenda item, will reasonably familiarize, you know, because, right, if it was someone that comes all the time, it's, well, you know what's going on. If it's someone who clearly has not done it before, all right, you'll have 3 minutes, and we won't take, right?
I've also seen where we take the policy and we kind of leave out as part of it, or we make it on a website a little bit, like more of a brochure
Right,
that is less policy-driven language and around, hey, this is what we heard. Take a look at this comment card, you know, a little snapshot of the comment, you know, here's how to do that. And
Right.
it's a little more, it's driven and grounded by policy, but it's, if someone came to the meeting, oh, how do I participate in a board meeting? And it's something we can post on the website too, grounded and reiterating what's here, but more,
Right.
like you said, in that moment, we're looking to help our public participate in some some way, and might be interested. So they can catch that on our website, catch it as a handout right there, like you said, helping them to know the process piece.
Right, and like I said, I'm not offended by having to read it at all. Sometimes I think it's kind of like when you're on an airplane and you're listening to the flight attendant giving the seatbelt instruction.
No, we all listen intently,
We all
every time
listen.
you say it, I don't know what you're talking about.
So, but at the same time, we want to be sure that people have fair understanding of how public
So we'll
participation
bring
works.
this forward, there's no change, but I would still bring forward, there's a couple other where we're not changing. Bring them forward for review, so we're updating the review cycle, so
Yeah.
that we've got a new date on those. So I would still be bringing forward those, so I do that with it, and let us mock up, and it's nothing bound by the policy timeline or that, but let us mock up what that might look like on our website, like how to participate in a board meeting, and more kind of flyers, in the setting, so that people could see and understand too.
That sounds great.
Okay, we will do that. Any other discussion on that item? Great. And then I'll, like I said, instead of revised, we'll just reviewed, no change would be there. And I would just capture our comments about how to help the public engage. The other is our old 188. This is the one that we wanted to have discussion, we did not discuss last time. This is the high school configuration review process. I wrote down a new number because I don't know what that number is. I'm leaning on Wasby to help me figure out where in the lineup this would go. It's clearly unique to us. But we have yet to discuss this as a group regarding any revisions.
Or do you want to have that discussion tonight?
Let's go, let's get, so when you look at this, we are certainly unique. We have a high school that is two high schools under one roof. And it is and isn't unique. So there's other schools that have where you have a school within a school. Waukesha, we have the School of Engineering nested inside South High School. Its own school, its own diploma, but part of that operations. But here, we have the really uniqueness of two different schools, how you're assigned to a school, which currently is kind of your born on date, and then athletics and all those pieces. They really are two distinct schools instead of a nested concept under one roof. So this is talking, and it's my understanding it kind of comes up because this is, this policy puts the conversations or potential for action aligned with elections, because it's asking for it to go to the electors to weigh in. Well, so we just really need to talk about the concepts of how do we formally review that configuration for the high school.
So what I don't like about the current policy is how long it would take if you wanted to implement going from the two high schools down to one. It starts with, I'd like to place this on the agenda. It's on the agenda, and then no less than 4 weeks later is followed up with an action item on an agenda. And then if that vote passes to continue with the process, then there's a task force that's formed, and they've got up to 4 months to come up with some recommendations. And then the board will vote on further recommendations at that point, so that's another meeting. Then you proceeds to step 3, which is a non-binding referendum to the public at a governor or presidential, election cycle. And then after that, it's public comment at 4 regularly scheduled meetings. So there's 4 more months potentially. And the reason I bring up the timeline, it's a huge decision, right, to go from 2 to 1. But there could certainly be a scenario where budget, if it comes down to, we can't afford to have 2 high schools anymore. We can't afford to have 2 football teams or whatever. I mean, it could be a decision that needs to be made quicker than just in 8 to 10 months here. So that's kind of the problem I have with the policy as it is it's just the time and that would go into following this process. declining enrollment, you know, all of our athletic teams, if we don't combine our schools by next year, are all gonna be Division 7, you know, but because of declining enrollment or whatever, so.
Yeah, so I think those concepts, like you said, the timeline, the task force, and the referendum are the really big kind of key pieces in this policy for consideration. And like you said, it's not a light subject.
No.
Well, I think that's why this was created, because it came up on a whim, more or less, back in 14. And this is the method to tap the brakes and slow that whole process down. Now, in a budget type situation, or declining enrollment, I mean, for all intents and purposes, the only thing that benefits from 2 high schools is athletics. And there, if enrollment's coming down, we're already co-oping teams. It doesn't take board action to decide that we're gonna co-op basketball or football or
The
whatever.
WIA would oversee that.
And there are
So
time
there's those
requirements there.
Yep, there's procedural pieces with WIA around any kind of co-op situation, and those have to be specifically authorized and signed off on by board president and myself.
Okay, but they don't require board action. But those, more and more of those specific actions happening, in my mind, would be further validation that this process, let's say, needs to be undertaken, because more and more of, or less and less of the value of having the twin model is being realized.
Yeah.
And as enrollment continues to decline, if we feel that there is an opportunity to reduce administrative headcount, we can act on that absent any of this stuff.
Correct.
So the policies construct doesn't prohibit us from the shorter term decision-making that may be needed from a financial perspective.
Sure.
What I think you want here is something that is really a transparent process
Yep.
for such a weighty
Right.
topic. So, you know, what's the purpose, what's the process in this? It's really unique to us.
And I don't want it to come up year after year after year on a whim. I totally agree with that. I think there's pieces of this like, you know, the non-binding referendum. I agree with that because you're basically taking a survey of your community, a non-binding survey, if you will. But why does it have to be a governor race or a presidential race? I mean, why can't we just say, non-binding referendum at a normal election in
At a
April,
general
or
election.
at a regularly scheduled April or November election?
Maybe, yeah, non-primary type thing.
And then the next one under step 4 is public comment at 4 regularly scheduled meetings. Why does it have to be 4? Why can't it be 2?
If it's important enough to people, they'll find a way to make it to one of the X, or if you do it for 4, you're gonna get the same speech at 4 meetings.
Yeah, right. So that's my only comment on the process is that. You know, the task force, I guess I'd ask for your guys' input on that. You know, that the task force is gonna be required, here's the kind of people that it lists out, parents, students, athletes. Well, you know, it's kind of like, well, duh,
But maybe not.
but maybe not. And who wants to be on it, who gets to be on it, how big is it gonna be? And it's really a non-binding task force,
Yeah.
so.
What's the purpose of a Chamber of Commerce rep? I am on the Chamber of Commerce, like,
The only thing I can think of is, again, attractiveness, because you've got a strong athletic program. I mean, that's really the only thing that would benefit from making this decision, is that we would have stronger teams, and my concern has always been you've got half the participation opportunities. but if you've got stronger teams, is that going to increase the attractiveness of the community to
So,
business
but,
owners?
but does it have to be a representative of the Chamber of Commerce? Isn't it just at-large community members?
Yeah.
That's what I think,
know,
right?
I
It
don't
lists literally
understand like that.
everybody.
Like you said, I mean, you want alumni, current students, as you said, the specific booster representation,
You want a
parents and
diverse
guardians, I would.
task force, I guess.
Yeah, that is interesting, because when you read that entire list, parents, students, athletes, principals of all levels, athletic directors, booster club, those all have direct deep ties to the school. And I really like our Chamber of Commerce, but then you get to a representative of the Chamber of Commerce, that does seem to kind of stick out like a sore thumb. And instead, if we say, well, the board has the ability to appoint community members at large, at that point in time, whatever the most relevant individuals in the community to invite, and it could be a member of the Chamber of Commerce.
What does community member mean?
Community members at large. Oh, that's a good question, because is it residents of the
You say
district?
resident of the district. Yeah.
Because what's the community?
That's different than a chamber member. I could own a business here.
Right. Yeah, and still live someplace else, but you're paying,
It's probably a taxpayer
You're a
in
taxpayer.
the district.
Do you even need to form this task force?
well, and I'm looking at it going, yeah, to the point of yesterday, the why. Why have this? Because you want to get community feedback, and you know it's going to be split 50-50.
And you're also gonna take a vote on a non-binding referendum, so that the community will have their chance to vote during that.
So is it more, comprised of a variety of stakeholders, including but not limited to, students, parents, like citizens of the community, business member, residents and, or business members, where you're getting that larger community, not just people who are in schools now, but as you said, we're stewards of the collective.
Right.
Um,
I think the task force is, it's that community listening session. We need to be open and again, go in knowing that we're probably going to get 51, 50 of the other in terms of opinions.
There's a lot of study that goes by, because, like you said, really understanding the nuances of the two schools, because there's sometimes benefit, or sometimes we make assumptions about the 1-2 schools limiting something in some way, and those might be false assumptions. So, like, you need a robust group to put together all the real variables and pros and cons of it, so you're really presenting, because again, you can have, it's no different than the system that I came from before, where that we've got neighbors that are K-8 Union High School feeders. You have a distinct identity, but you're working collaboratively, but they have what are those nuances? It feels very much like that, like when are your own and when are you separate? What are the pros and cons? And when we revisit those, what does that look like? So we're really transparent in the process. As you said, it's not just one random, like, I want this on an agenda. This is really big, and this has a process to it. And what we're sure of is there has to be representative participation from a variety of groups.
And I wanna know who leads the task force. I mean, it calls out principals, athletic directors, teachers.
You
But-
need this to be your superintendent.
Well, I think so,
And
but-
maybe co-chaired by a board member, that there's some kind of something there. You cannot defer that kind of thing. And you can't leave it up to this task force to like anoint their own person. There's so much information gathering, setting, et cetera. And also too, this is a task force that has no rules around it in any way. We just set out operating expectations for any committee, any work group, anything. Are they subject to those? Are they operating in that? Do they have to have posted stuff? Shouldn't they be meeting publicly? Shouldn't there be
Yeah.
something posted? And it's like their own it's good that we have it, but I think we have to put in some, like, here's how they're gonna operate.
I agree.
Subject to.
Or subject
work
to
team.
committee, yeah, subject to
meeting.
committee rules, subject to something, so that even that is more clear. Otherwise, this could be
Because it is.
an interesting group, like, it's a point where they feel like they anoint their own person, and they're meeting who knows where, where's their minute, where's their stuff, like, how is that
It would
transparent?
function like the public task force, which, that was their own deal, and they approached us about doing, this is being commissioned by the board.
Yes.
It needs
And
tighter
everything
pedagogy
like that,
principles.
you know, it would be unusual for any organization to have someone operating outside of itself
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah,
That's
agreed.
unusual, so,
And then at the end of that task force section, after the task force presents its recommendations, the board will vote on whether or not to accept the recommendation. So if the recommendation is, keep it the way it is, the board's gonna take a vote and say, we don't accept that recommendation, and we want to continue to,
yeah, it dies.
well, wait a minute, if the board votes not to change the high school configuration, it stops. But the board could then take, so we could take a vote that says, we don't like we don't accept your recommendation of keeping things the same. We're gonna take another vote that says we want to further consider changes, which is the last sentence of that section.
Then you move to the referendum, the non-binding referendum.
And so,
That's the thanks but no thanks option.
so the board, okay, let me ask you this. What if the recommendation is to combine the high schools? So they present the recommendation, the board votes on whether or not to accept the recommendation, and the board votes yes. Your recommendation was to combine it, we vote yes that we accept that recommendation. Then do we not have to do step 3 and 4?
No, you must.
You must proceed to step 3.
If
You have to go to the non-binding
You must
referendum.
go to 3 and 4.
Well, no,
No.
But it says prior to that, if the board votes not to change the high school configuration, so oh, I see, you said combine, Joel, never mind.
After the task force presents a recommendation, the board votes on whether or not to accept the recommendation.
So the recommendation is combine.
And we vote that, yes, we accept that recommendation.
Mhm.
Now, if you read on, it says, if the board votes not to change the high school, the process ends. If the board votes to further consider changes, it must be step 3 and 4. Well, I don't want to vote to further consider changes, I want to accept the recommendation of the task force.
Yeah.
So we can skip steps 3 and 4, right?
Well,
Well,
You know what,
yeah.
I think it's the word further,
yeah.
because I think probably when written, it was,
If the-
you're either keeping it the same or you're changing it. But the word further, to me, is also misplaced because it opens up another window of the board to, yeah,
Do
I'm
even
gonna change
more.
it, but now we're gonna go further
We're going to go in a
off the
different
grid of
direction.
this committee,
Right.
and then do that, you know, so that's.
It should read if the board votes not to accept, or if the board votes to accept the recommendations of the task force.
Right, and I think then that loophole is, and the board cannot accept that, and you can push them back to committee or task force. Like, we'd like to see X, Y, and Z, and push that back as a task to them, to get that refined to a point where the board accepts moving on, or be done, you know. But I think that's where, what the board doesn't want to do in this case, you don't want to hear, we want to change, and then a task force says, yeah, go forward with changing, and then you guys are creating your own playbook on it. You want it grounded in some kind of recommendation, but you might have really good perspective input, you've been working with your constituents on, have you considered X, Y, and Z, or we're stuck on this isn't fleshed out enough, and pushing it back. It feels like that piece of process is missing. Because I don't think it's this board's intention at all is to then, like you said, or any board to all of a sudden then, oh, and then we're further gonna change it on our own. This group of 7.
Well, and that's an interesting question though, if the way that this is written, is the board bound
Correct.
only to be able to move forward specifically the recommendation of the committee. You know, if the committee says, well, we want you to, and I know this is a silly example, 3/4 of the way combine. You know, we may look at that and say, well,
Is it, isn't it, what is it?
no, I mean, let's say the board, after all the attorneys said that's an interesting suggestion, but we want to fully combine, or we don't want to combine, whatever it is. I mean, are we bound, is our universe bound and limited to the recommendation that comes from the committee? I mean, to me, it sounds like, or the committee, the task force, to me what it sounds like is the task force can recommend changes, but it's not binding, it's
Right.
informative.
Right.
It's informative, it's another stop on the whole, you know, we have public participation, and we've got this. I mean, I think, you know, what I like to say is, the board will receive the recommendation. Then at that point in time, if the board is gonna make a change, then we move on. If the board decides we're not making any changes, then this process stops.
So isn't it taking out those two if statements, and it's just the committee presents it, and the board will take action?
Right.
Mhm. And I think to help hem in the task force, you know, up at the beginning of step 2, the board will commission a task force. I think the board would need to give them clear definition. I mean, at the end of the day, you're combining 2 high schools into one. Do we need to get into what that all looks like? Again, it's pretty limited to athletics, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
Not necessarily.
they're gonna review
And
academic,
administration.
athletic, non-athletic, extracurricular scholarship factors.
But yeah,
Yeah,
there's
okay.
certain,
So-
there's certain
That's what's
funding,
in there now.
like
That's-
DOJ grants, I doubled down because I have 2 unique IDs for high schools. You know, there's a whole complexity. Like I said, you can do 2 separate schools, a nested school,
Yeah.
it is bigger than
Okay.
just the athletics piece.
I'm wondering, I do like having a policy on this, but I'm wondering if we need to almost start from scratch on it.
Okay.
Just, instead of, you know, us trying to interpret what the author of this meant back in 2015, maybe we need to talk about, you know, how we're gonna gather input from the public. Does it need to be a task force, or can it be community listening sessions? We're gonna conduct 4 of those or something. I don't know, but maybe we need to start from scratch and redo this policy altogether.
Why don't we take it as a discussion item to our board and just say, you know, here's what we had, here's the concepts that we mulled over, this is where we think we are.
Mhm.
What input do you have
That's good.
on that?
Yeah,
And
that's
then-
good, that brings public,
And then
transparency
even,
to
and,
it.
yeah, and even then too, then it's up there for discussion, and again, this is part of our procedural policy reviews, like, hey, if you wanna give input, please let me know.
And it could be, let's keep this policy, but we need to clarify some things,
Yeah,
or
right?
start from scratch and do a new one, I don't know.
You know, it's interesting looking at the litany of who comprises this task force, and now thinking about the scholarships. Where is Collins' representation in there?
Yeah,
well, if we give more scholarship than just columns, that's huge, don't get me wrong.
So,
But
okay,
then
then
almost double that.
a more generalized, you know, scholarship entity representation or something along those lines of, if we would do this, how does that impact
Everything.
your process, your decision-making? You know, I don't know, certain scholarships that have been gifted are certainly by school, and, you know, are there bylaws in there that would, oh, sorry, you gotta roll that back?
Mhm.
the very last sentence of step 4, the board will determine whether any or what changes will be made. And so, to me, that means you've gone through all these steps, but the very last sentence is, it is up to the board
Mhm.
on what the changes are, if any.
And I know, like, that can be, some people can look at that and go, oh, that's too much, but you're an elected body
Oh, yeah.
who's listening to the public, so that, you know, you're working on that authority and that scope and that understanding of the weight and responsibility of your work.
My next door neighbor was on the school board when they took a look at this.
Get some background.
Yeah, and I remember asking him, I said, hey, how do you think the vote's gonna go tonight? Are they gonna combine the high school? And he said, I would be shocked if we did because of the input from the community. You know, and I don't know how they got that input, if it was surveys or what it was, but the community at the time overwhelmingly wanted to keep two high schools. And so as the elected representative of the community, he was telling me, I would be shocked if, you know, board members voted in favor of combining because of the input we've received.
Why don't I do a little fact finding too, because what's interesting, I forget the name of the district, they're literally looking at us and maybe doing this model, like what's your why? And there's been other districts, when I worked in Oak Creek, we got to the point, where do we need to consider two high schools? And how did that go to the community? And the community said no. So they're under one giant umbrella. And how did you make the decision? What are the ramifications of that decision with having a 2,000 kid plus high school? You know, and looking at that, because we still are solidly 1,000, each. So then you're looking at a large high school. So what are that? So I think maybe some background to help look at and think about process, like you said, almost from scratch, and who's having to live with configuration conversations right now, and what are they thinking? What's the process look like to help?
I'd be curious if
Help
they
that.
even have policy on it, or if it's just
No,
something that comes up that, geez, we need to make a decision here, and, but anyway, I personally like the fact there's a policy, because like you said, I don't want after every school board election that people want this on the agenda, and let's talk about it year after year after year. We don't need that. So I like having it in policy and having a process.
So we're gonna do a little more digging. We're gonna have this, like you said, discussion with our board, and just like, here's where we're at, we need more input. And we're doing a little digging and seeing what we're trying to help lead us to what's a good process look like.
It'll be interesting when we put this on a regular board meeting agenda.
Yeah, good, but
Well, will the community immediately think, oh geez, what are they doing here? Are they combining? It's no. We are just simply talking about the policy itself. We are not talking about combining.
Yep.
high school.
Right, no. I think, I agree with you, Joel. If there was one thing that I think the board should really look at, this can only be placed on a gubernatorial or presidential election, because maybe I did my math wrong, but the next gubernatorial election is 22, then we've got a presidential 24. The point is,
every 2 years.
it's every 2 years. And so that means there is a 2-year, by this policy, blackout period where, and I'm making this up, that if it costs $10 million a year more to have the high schools combined or separated or whatever it may be, there's a 2-year blackout period where we can't do a thing about it. I mean, I guess we have control over the budget, but we're gonna have 2 schools and we're gonna, it doesn't make sense. And I worry about that we're handicapping it. I think there is lots of good reason to have an orderly process that's not quick. But to handicap the board for a 2-year blackout period seems really, really onerous. I mean, I think it's, it restricts our ability. If there is a need to make a decision, we can't make a decision. And I don't know that the community wants to paralyze itself as a result, if that's a decision that needs to be made.
Yeah, excellent.
If we're getting enough public input in other ways, do we even need to have a referendum? Whether it's governor race or presidential or just a normal April, does that even need that?
Well, I would think that if, I'll say something catastrophic, something significant, like, COVID comes along and the bottom falls out, and there's a collective acknowledgement that this is onerous, I mean, it's our policy. We can go change it. It has to follow the normal policy change cycle, so it might be 2 months. But we could throw the whole thing out if
We
it
could,
was blatantly obvious.
what did we do? We could suspend it. We could vote to suspend this policy at our next board meeting and then combine the high schools at the next board meeting. I mean, we could.
Sorry, folks.
Justin.
Not gonna happen for those of you watching at home.
No, I think, again, I think the idea is it's a statement to the community that, look, we get it, this is an important decision.
Correct.
That is very, very near and dear to people's hearts, and so it's not something that we would ever intend to do quickly.
I agree.
So to that extent, I support it, but I think some of the provisions in it maybe are just a bit too extensive.
Yeah, and we'll be able to do enough, kind of digging, like I said, let's keep it on the cycle for the full board to talk about, like, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're doing, here's kind of the next step, and then it'll come back to, we've got consistent meetings, come back and dig in a little bit more. This is what I'm
Sounds
saying, where there might have some where you don't get to close out the whole 100 series, like, this is big, we need to do a little more work, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay.
Excellent. Good
Let's move
discussion. That was our one that we deferred our discussion because we knew it was gonna be big. So thank you for that. So again, that was old 180, I'll seek a little guidance, what's the best numbering for that? No one has this. They're gonna say, you could make up a number, Jen. The other was virtual board meetings. We reviewed it. There was no change. The board superintendent relations, again, we reviewed it. There was no change, but I would still bring it forward just to update that review date. With us, reviewed the evaluation, reviewed it, no change. And the last one was 260, it was when you're out that you've got a second in charge kind of piece. Again, it's not required, and I mocked up the language based on our discussion, but is this just part of our administrative procedure?
I think so.
Do you feel that you need a separate?
The person in charge is never gonna be a board member, and so I don't know why this has to be board policy. I think it's a superintendent administrative handbook type of a thing on how you handle it if the director of technology is gonna be gone for 2 weeks. You
Right.
need someone to help in his department. I don't see this as board policy.
Yeah, I mean, and we, like you said, if principals are out, we're making sure people have access to administrative. We have a full team here, so if I'm out of, on school business or, a personal day, that kind of thing, we make sure that that's handled and that's delegated. It's just part of natural procedure, so.
The superintendent obviously will
Mhm.
have communication with board members,
Mhm.
and we'll know if you're gonna be
Yeah.
on
Oh.
vacation for 2 weeks, and
Yeah, well, I don't do that during school. That's part of practice. But, in that, like you said, in those, and I have, and certainly, I've had surgery and had to be out I was out for 2 weeks, and it's like, okay, hey, board, here's what I do, here's this, here's the problem, here's what's going on. There's communication around that, like you said, we're making sure people know that. And we've all, myself, Lenny in HR, we're principals ourselves. When our principals are out, if, we want them to participate in their own learning, that could be out for school business, working with a team, that kind of thing. We office over there, we make sure things are covered. You've got kind of that second in charge piece, so let's try and fly without it, shall we?
yeah.
I think we'll be
I
all right.
agree. I think
So then I'm
so.
gonna recommend removal for that. And then you can see the list below, so we've gotten through everything that we wanted to change and get through. A couple more based on our conversation today to revise and get you to kind of look at. And then all the others were ones that we've cleaned up, we've incorporated, see no need for, and removed. Any last kicks at the cat for those?
Can't thank you enough for all the work that goes into this.
Yep, and for guiding us through it, appreciate it.
You're a great team to work with. You're solid thinkers and really weighing everything
Same to,
really nicely, so thank you.
same to you guys for being on this committee with me, and, it's important work, but, interesting, and
Yeah, it's important, and I agree. Thanks, we bring different vantage points and opinions, I like it.
So again, I'll clean up everything that we talked about. I'll go ahead and link those in here, so this is updated. Again, for our public, I'll alert our board to that as we plan the next agenda. Here's the intention. I'll really foreshadow the one, like, we're not kicking anything off on this high school one. We really just need some dialogue and some input as we continue to explore it, and the ones for removal. So we'll do that at a future agenda.
Sounds good.
thank you. We'll stand adjourned.